The Rise and Fall of Carthage, the Rival of Rome, Ancient History Documentary. Before Rome ruled the world, another great power ruled the seas. Long before Caesar's legions marched across continents, there was Carthage, the queen of the Mediterranean, built on trade, courage, and ambition. Founded by sailors and merchants from the east, Carthage rose from the coast of North Africa. For hundreds of years, Carthage was rich and powerful, controlling the trade routes of the Mediterranean. But across the sea, a powerful enemy was growing. One enemy would define their destiny and would not rest until Carthage was ash and dust. That enemy was Rome. At first, they were partners. They traded, signed treaties, and for a time they shared the same sea in peace. But peace between two rising powers never lasts forever. Soon, competition turned to fear, fear turned to hate, and hate turned to war. What followed were the Punic Wars, 3 massive conflicts that would decide who would rule the ancient world and who would be erased from it: Rome, the empire of land, or Carthage, the empire of the sea. From the fearless voyages of Carthaginian explorers, to the genius of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his war elephants, to the final destruction of a once great city. This is the story of the rise and fall of Carthage, the city that dared to rival Rome and paid the ultimate price. The people of the Purple Sea. Long before Carthage's towers rose above the sea, their ancestors had come from far to the east, from the mountains and coasts of ancient Lebanon. Around 3000 BC, those people, known later as the Phoenicians, carved out their lives between mountain and sea. Lebanon's mountains were once cloaked in dense forests of cedar, pine, and oak. The air smelled of sap and salt. The terrain was rugged and too steep for great cities, but perfect for shipbuilding. Below, along the narrow strip of coastline, the first Phoenician harbors appeared: Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and Berytus. Small, independent city-states connected by trade, by language, and by gods. They did not call themselves Phoenicians. That was a Greek name, Phoenix, meaning purple people, a reference to the deep crimson dye that made them famous. The Greeks marveled at their skill, at how these seafarers turned a simple mollusk from the sea into color fit for kings. But to themselves they were simply Canaanites, the people of the coast, the masters of the horizon. For centuries, the Phoenicians lived under the shadow of greater powers, with Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the east. Both demanded tribute. Both saw the Phoenician cities as subjects to be taxed, not equals to be respected. The worst of these overlords were the Assyrians, a group of ruthless conquerors who swept across the Near East like fire. From 1200 to 700 BC, the land between the rivers and the sea was a battlefield. Empires rose and fell, and the Assyrians became the nightmare of nations. They enslaved whole populations, razed cities to ash, and carried their spoils back to their capitals in northern Mesopotamia, what is now modern Iraq. The Phoenicians, pragmatic and cunning, survived by paying tribute in silver, cedar, and copper. They learned that submission could be a shield, and diplomacy, a weapon sharper than any sword. When the Assyrian kings demanded gold, the Phoenicians smiled and delivered more than enough to keep their cities safe. But they did not forget. Beneath their polite obedience, they waited. And when the old empires began to crumble, they seized their chance. Even as Egypt and Assyria faltered, the Phoenicians thrived. They became the middlemen of the ancient world, with traders who could move anything, anywhere. Their craftsmanship was unmatched. They made jewelry of gold and lapis, carved ivory into delicate shapes, and molded glass so thin it caught the light like water. Their silver bowls and fine pottery were prized in every royal court. Yet their true wealth lay not in artistry, but in timber. The cedar forests of Lebanon were sacred, and the pharaohs of Egypt coveted them. Egypt had no great trees of its own. Every temple, every barge for the gods required Phoenician wood. One Egyptian text tells of a priest named Wenamun, sent around 1100 BC to the city of Byblos to buy timber for the god Amun's temple ships. In earlier centuries, such a request might have been granted freely, since Egypt was, after all, the power of the world. But times had changed. The king of Byblos, Chekabal, met the priest's request with a demand of his own, payment and plenty of it. Gold, silver, ropes, sacks of lentils, even baskets of fish. Egypt was weak, and the Phoenicians knew it. For the first time in centuries, they no longer bowed to the pharaohs. This moment marked the beginning of a new age. The old empires were dying, and the Phoenicians were stepping out from their shadows. They were no longer servants to kings. They were becoming the merchants of empires. By the 8th century BC, the Phoenician world had divided. In the east, Tyre still ruled the seas of the Levant. But far to the west, a new city began to rise. It was named Carthage. Founded, according to legend, by Queen Dido, Carthage began as a small colony, a Phoenician outpost built on the coast of modern Tunisia. Its settlers brought with them the gods of Tyre, the language of Canaan, and the skill of shipwrights. But in the western Mediterranean, they found opportunity. The lands of North Africa, rich in grain and minerals, became the foundation of a maritime empire. From Carthage, Phoenician sailors reached as far as Spain and beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. To the Greeks, they were still Phoenicians. To the Romans, they were Punici. But to themselves, they were something greater. They were Carthaginians, heirs of Tyre, masters of the sea. Their fleets carried not just goods, but influence. Their harbors became centers of wealth, science, and religion. And soon, their ambitions would bring them face to face with another rising power, a power born not of sailors, but of soldiers. The world was changing. The balance of power was shifting. And from the blue waters of the Mediterranean to the green hills of Italy, a storm was brewing. A storm that would one day decide who would rule the ancient world. The birth of a maritime empire. Carthage began as nothing more than a small colony with a distant outpost on the North African shore. But in time, that humble settlement would rise into one of the most powerful cities the ancient world had ever known. Its secret was geography. Carthage sat upon the Gulf of Tunis, a natural harbor that gazed out across the heart of the Mediterranean. Every merchant ship that traveled between the east and the west had to pass this very stretch of water. Whoever controlled Carthage controlled the crossroads of the ancient world, so the city's rise was no accident. It was fate disguised as a strategy and turned into legend. According to the tales told for centuries, Carthage was founded by a princess named Elissa, known to the Romans as Dido, a woman as brilliant as she was beautiful. She fled her homeland, Tyre, a mighty Phoenician city on the coast of Lebanon, after her brother, the ambitious and ruthless King Pygmalion, murdered her husband for gold. Carrying her followers across the sea, Dido landed upon the sunlit shores of North Africa, a place of rolling hills and golden sands, where the scent of cedar and salt hung in the air. There she approached a local chieftain, King Yerbus, and asked for a small parcel of land upon which to build her new home. The king, perhaps amused by her request, agreed, but with a clever condition. She could have only as much land as could be enclosed by a single cowhide. But Dido, daughter of Tyre, was no ordinary refugee. She cut that hide into razor-thin strips, stretching them end to end until they encircled a vast hill overlooking the bay. The land she claimed that day would become Carthage, the new city. And while many called it legend, buried beneath that myth lay a truth. Carthage really was founded by settlers from Tyre, sometime in the 9th or 8th century BC. The ruins tell us as much, but no empire rises from a love story alone. The birth of Carthage was not merely the act of a fleeing queen, it was the move of a seafaring civilization seeking a new frontier. A Phoenician colony was never chosen by accident. Every harbor, every stretch of coastline was chosen with a merchant's mind and a general's eye. Carthage's position on the Gulf of Tunis wasn't just convenient but perfect. From there, Phoenician traders could reach Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and the coasts of Italy with ease. It was a hub from which they could control not just trade, but power. By the 7th century BC, barely a century after its founding, Carthage had already grown into a city of more than 30,000 people. In the ancient world, that number was extraordinary, a population rivaling some of Greece's largest city-states. Its layout reflected both order and ambition. The lower city near the sea was alive with markets, workshops, and shipyards, the rhythm of hammers and the cries of merchants heard through its streets. Fishermen unloaded their catch beside traders from far-off lands, silver from Iberia, spices from Arabia, gold from Africa. Above the lower city rose the Byrsa Hill, the upper city also referred to as the heart of Carthage's power. Behind its fortified walls stood temples, palaces, and the homes of the elite. merchants, admirals, and statesmen whose fortunes were tied to the winds and waves. From its very foundation, Carthage became a machine designed for trade, defense, and dominion. To the Greeks, who told much of the ancient world's stories, the Carthaginians were clever. They saw in them a reflection of their own mercantile instincts, shrewd negotiators, masters of deals that always seemed to favor themselves. But the Greeks, for all their philosophy and poetry, also understood power. And they knew that if you could control the story, you could control the memory of the past. So, much of what history tells us about Carthage comes from Greek pens, and later Roman ones. Enemies of Carthage wrote the story of Carthage, and in their telling, cunning became deceit, diplomacy became guile, and ambition became arrogance. Yet beneath those biases, one truth was clear: the Phoenician settlers had created something extraordinary, a civilization that blended commerce with strategy, faith with enterprise, and survival with vision. Historians still debate why Carthage, and not other Phoenician colonies like Gadara, became the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was more than a trading port. It was built as a stronghold with a fortress that could defend Phoenician interests across the seas. It was both a marketplace and a military outpost, a naval base positioned to protect trade routes stretching from North Africa to Iberia. By the 6th century BC, Carthage's influence reached far beyond its walls. It became the center of a massive network of colonies and client cities, with its ships patrolling from Morocco to Malta, and its merchants exchanging goods in every harbor they touched. Inside Carthage, the government was run by a system of councils and elected officials, with a model surprisingly sophisticated for its age. At its head were the suffets, the city's chief magistrates, chosen yearly by a citizen assembly. They presided over the Senate, a gathering of wealthy merchants and generals who debated matters of law, trade, and war. In this council chamber, decisions were made that could alter the course of nations. New trade agreements, expansions of the fleet, or the establishment of colonies abroad. Every plan, every law was designed with one goal in mind: to keep the sea under Carthaginian control. At first, Carthage's ambitions were practical with profit and protection. Like all Phoenician cities, they sought metals, dyes, timber, and grain. But as their wealth grew, so did their hunger for dominance. They expanded along the coasts of Sardinia, Sicily, Corsica, and Spain. All these locations are islands and lands that offer both resources and reach. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Carthage began to transform from a network of traders into something far more formidable, something like an empire. Historians call this imperial creep, the moment when merchants become rulers and trade routes become frontiers. By the 4th century BC, Carthage was no longer merely the heir of Tyre, it was its successor and its superior. The city had become a superpower, commanding the central and western Mediterranean with fleets unmatched in speed or size, but every empire that rises casts a shadow. And across the sea, younger and hungrier power was beginning to stir. That power was Rome, and soon the seas that had once carried only trade would run red with war. The Empire of Trade. By the 6th century before the birth of Christ, Carthage had become the beating heart of a vast trading network, its ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean like veins pumping wealth into the body of an empire. From the southern coasts of Spain, they brought home salted fish and silver, dug from Iberian mines so deep that men vanished into them and never returned. Across the sea, Greek pottery flowed through Carthage's ports, carried by Phoenician merchants to the western colonies and African hinterlands. To the north and west, tin came from Galicia, and even, some believed, from the mist-shrouded Isles of Britain, where the sun vanished behind grey horizons, and the winds carried whispers of another world. And then there were men, women, and children, traded like any other commodity. They came from conquered lands or from piracy on the open sea, destined for farms, ships, and quarries. In Carthage, even humanity was part of the marketplace. In return, the Carthaginians sent out goods of their own. They are usually purple-dyed cloth, the most coveted fabric of antiquity, extracted from tens of thousands of tiny murex shells, finely crafted metalwork, gleaming bronze and silver bowls, tools and ornaments, and ceramics whose designs and durability made them prized across 3 continents. Their merchants didn't just deal with other cities. They penetrated deep into the African interior, trading with Berber tribes and caravan kingdoms that stretched southward beyond the Sahara. In exchange, Carthage received gold dust, ivory, and gemstones, goods so rare they dazzled the temples of kings and adorned the necks of queens. The city's markets became a mosaic of color and sound, with the cries of traders and the scent of oils and spices. The Carthaginians were craftsmen, innovators, and artists. Their ancestors, the Phoenicians, were said to have invented glass-blowing, a skill that transformed the way the ancient world saw beauty and light. They mastered metalwork, shaping tools and jewelry so intricate that even the Bible itself spoke with admiration of their handiwork. From the sands of Iraq to the valleys of northern Italy, archaeologists still find their creations that included bronze bowls with delicate carvings, silver ornaments adorned with scenes of gods and sailors, fragments of colored glass that once caught the Mediterranean sun. To own a Carthaginian artifact was to possess a piece of the sea itself, with a mark of sophistication and connection to the great web of trade that bound civilizations together. Their art was a symbol of control. Every craft, every coin, every amphora carried the message of a city that thrived on commerce, that believed mastery over materials mirrored mastery over the world. For Carthage, trade was the lifeblood of society, and wealth was power. A merchant with enough ships could buy influence. A trader with the right contacts could decide policy. The city had no citizen army of its own. Instead, Carthage paid others to fight its wars. They had mercenaries from Iberia, Numidia, and Gaul, men who fought for silver, not for homeland. And to pay them, Carthage needed profit. So everything from its colonies to its political system revolved around trade. Each colony was not just a settlement, but a node in a massive commercial network and a chain of harbors, warehouses, and trading stations that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. Few realized that these Phoenician outposts became the first true cities of Europe. Cadiz in Spain, founded around 1100 BC, still thrives today as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Malaga followed 2 centuries later, Granada 3 centuries after that. In Sardinia, the Phoenicians built Cagliari. In Sicily, they raised the ports of Trapani and Palermo, and even the picturesque cliffs of Sorrento on the Italian mainland bore their mark. Everywhere they went, they left behind their language, their gods, and their knowledge of the sea, shaping the Mediterranean world long before the first Roman ship ever left the Tiber. Every city they built had its gods. Temples and sanctuaries rose from the ground, stone sentinels watching over the harbors and markets. In Carthage, the most sacred places were the Tophets, holy grounds filled with stone markers carved with symbols of their gods. Here the Carthaginians prayed for protection, for harvest, for victory at sea. Their gods were a melting pot of deities drawn from the ancient Near East, Egypt, and Greece. Their pantheon was massive as a result of centuries of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. At its center was El, the great creator, the father of gods and men, Astarte, his consort, goddess of heaven, love, and war, and Baal, the fiery sun god, the bringer of rain, the lord of renewal and destruction alike. Their religion was multicultural by design, open to foreign influences. Egyptian Isis and Osiris found altars in their temples. Greek Demeter and Persephone were worshipped under new names. Religion defined Carthaginian life. Every deal, every voyage, every act of state began with an offering to the gods. In every Carthaginian colony from Sicily to Spain, the temple stood at the center, as if to remind the people that their fortunes were tied not only to the sea, but to the heavens. But behind this faith was a reputation that would haunt Carthage through history. In the face of their rivals, the Carthaginians were terrifying. Writers claimed that in times of war, famine, or crisis, the people of Carthage turned to blood sacrifice. Amid the burning altars, they offered not only animals, but their own children to the gods. The accounts describe drums and flutes drowning out the cries, priests raising their arms to the heavens as the flames rose, Whether these stories were true or propaganda remains debated even today. But what is undeniable is how deeply they stirred fear and revulsion in the hearts of Carthage's enemies. To the Romans, it became a symbol of everything they believed themselves not to be, a reason to see Carthage not as a rival but as a menace. And when two powers believe the world is only big enough for one, war is never far away. The shadows of the gods. The ancient writers spoke in horror of the Carthaginians. Greek historians like Diodorus of Sicily recorded that the wealthy citizens of Carthage would, in moments of crisis, offer their own newborn sons to the flames. The sacrifices were said to be made to Baal Hammon, the great god of the city, also known as the father of storm and fire. In giving up what was most precious, the people of Carthage believed they could appease divine anger, ensure rain for their fields, and secure the city's protection from war and famine. It was said the infants were placed into the outstretched bronze hands of Baal's statue, and as the fire rose beneath, the hands would tilt, sending the offerings tumbling into the inferno below. It was, if true, a ritual of unbearable grief and unspeakable devotion. But did it ever truly happen? Or was this, as many now argue, a creation of Carthage's enemies, a weapon of words designed to brand the city forever as monstrous and inhuman? For centuries, scholars have argued, at the Tophet, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of urns, each containing the ashes and bones of infants and small animals. In the face of the devout, these were symbolic offerings, tokens of faith to ensure prosperity and divine favor. But to others, the evidence pointed to something far more grim. In the Bardo Museum in Tunis, countless stelae from the Tophet are displayed, their surfaces carved with strange, haunting images, including crescent moons, stars, and raised hands. One in particular has transfixed researchers for generations. It depicts a priest, his hand extended in a distinctive gesture standing before an altar flame. The gesture, identical to one described in ancient texts, suggests the act of sacrifice. Just beyond those sacred walls, Carthage throbbed with life and power. Visitors arriving by sea would first glimpse the outer commercial harbour, a vast circular basin where merchant ships from Greece, Egypt, and Iberia unloaded their cargo of silver, spices, grain, and timber. Beyond it lies a hidden entrance leading to the inner naval harbour, the city's most jealously protected military asset. This inner harbour was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It was circular, ringed by stone quays and covered ship sheds, each one large enough to house a warship. At its centre stood a small island crowned with the Admiralty, where Carthage's naval commanders planned their operations and where the great fleet could be mustered at a moment's notice. At full strength, this harbour could shelter over 200 warships, an armada waiting silently behind its walls. It was a marvel of design and secrecy, the engine of Carthage's power and the instrument of its destiny. Even today, the ring-shaped harbour and its central island can still be traced on the Tunisian coast, the bones of an empire that once ruled the waves. For centuries, historians wondered how Carthage had achieved such mastery over shipbuilding, how a city of merchants could produce fleets so vast, so swift, and so deadly. The answer would come unexpectedly from the sea itself. In 1969, off the western coast of Sicily near Marsala, divers discovered the wreck of an ancient ship buried beneath sand and coral. When it was brought to the surface, the markings on its timbers caused astonishment. Punic lettering labeling each plank and beam. It was a Carthaginian warship perfectly preserved from the 3rd century BC, and it revealed a secret that would change our understanding of ancient engineering forever. The Carthaginians, it turned out, had pioneered modular shipbuilding. Every plank, every rib, every piece of the vessel was prefabricated, marked with codes that indicated where it belonged. The ships could be assembled quickly, efficiently in dockyards, where hundreds of craftsmen worked in perfect coordination. This was industrial warfare, 2,000 years before the modern age. Carthage had achieved what no other civilization had, a system capable of producing entire fleets with mechanical precision. Their warships were light, fast, and deadly. Built with shallow drafts, they could glide close to shore or retreat swiftly into open water. In battle, their masts were lowered and sails furled as the ships became oared beasts of war, driven by hundreds of rowers working in brutal rhythm. The triremes had 3 tiers of rowers, the mighty quinqueremes, 5. Discipline aboard these vessels was absolute, where one heartbeat out of rhythm could spell disaster. At the front of the ship was a bronze spike made to break through enemy ships. One strong hit could send the whole vessel and its crew to the bottom of the sea, and often to protect them from misfortune, Carthaginian ships bore painted eyes on their bows with symbols to see their way through the waves and to ward off evil. For centuries, the Greeks had challenged Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. From the end of the 6th century BC, their rivalry erupted into countless naval clashes, fought off the coasts of Sicily and Sardinia, islands that became the chessboard of empire. But as time went on, a new enemy rose from the north, a city that would one day rewrite the map of the ancient world. The Carthaginians called them the Romans. In 2013, archaeologists dredging the waters near Marsala found the remains of one of those epic battles. They included ramheads, helmets, and shattered timbers littering the seafloor, silent witnesses to the fury that once engulfed the waves. It was the first war between Rome and Carthage, a conflict that would decide who ruled the Mediterranean. It would last 23 years, destroy fleets beyond counting, and mark the beginning of the end for Carthage. But that is a story for the next chapter. The Battle of the Aegates. Beneath the restless waters off the Aegates Islands near the coast of Sicily lies one of the most haunting relics of the ancient world, the only underwater battlefield ever discovered from antiquity. Spread across 2 square kilometers of seabed, the silence hides the traces of chaos. There, archaeologists have found anchors twisted in coral, helmets dented by rams, amphorae shattered by impact, and 11 bronze rams, the very weapons that once tore through enemy ships. These are the remains of the Battle of the Aegates, fought in 241 BC, a colossal naval clash between Carthage and Rome, a duel that would change the fate of the Mediterranean forever. The battle is vividly recorded in the writings of Polybius, Diodorus, and other ancient historians. Among the relics recovered from the seabed, one ram bears an inscription, carved in the elegant strokes of Punic script with a desperate prayer to the heavens to help destroy the enemy's ships. But the gods of Carthage were silent that day. The Romans, with land-bound soldiers who had once feared the sea, won. For the first time in history, Rome defeated Carthage at sea. And with that victory, the First Punic War that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century came to an end. Carthage had lost not just a battle, but its grip on the Western Mediterranean. But how had Rome overcome the most formidable seafaring power of the age? At the start of the war, the Romans were utterly unprepared for naval combat. They were land warriors, masters of formations, fortifications, and swordplay, but strangers to the waves. At this point, the sea was a foreign battlefield, unpredictable, treacherous, and ruled by Carthage. Yet the Romans were nothing if not relentless. When they captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship, they copied it. Every joint, every beam, every plank was measured and replicated. Soon, Roman dockyards thundered with the sound of hammers and saws. In mere months, they had built an entire fleet, modeled on the designs of their enemy. And in their typical fashion, they added a brutal innovation known as the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land battles. When Roman ships rammed their foes, the corvus slammed down onto the enemy deck, locking the ships together. Roman soldiers would then storm across the bridge, transforming the fight into the kind of close combat they knew best. This resulted in a terrifying hybrid of naval warfare, and one that would eventually bring the mighty Carthaginian navy to its knees. It was ironic. The Romans had conquered the sea only by imitating their enemy, a civilization that had once invented shipbuilding itself. The Phoenicians, Carthage's ancestors, were the pioneers of maritime engineering. From the harbors of Tyre and Sidon to the shipyards of Carthage, they refined the art of constructing vessels capable of crossing oceans. Their techniques were so advanced that even centuries later, the Romans referred to certain shipbuilding methods as Punic joints, the distinctive tongue and groove system used to fasten planks. It was the foundation of naval craftsmanship, and even today, the principles of their design still guide modern shipbuilding, though wood has been replaced by steel and plastic, and hammers by machines. But the Carthaginians did not build ships only for war. They built them for distance, for discovery, for dominion over the horizon. For their trading expeditions, the Carthaginians used vessels far different from their warships. These were broad-bellied cargo ships with deep hulls and towering stern. They were slow, but able to carry grain, metals, spices, textiles, and entire families of settlers. Each ship was like a floating marketplace, its decks stacked high with goods for bartering, and its cabins filled with sailors, merchants, and sometimes livestock. Because of their immense size, the Greeks mockingly called them gorloi, meaning tubs. But these tubs carried the wealth of Carthage across the known world. And aboard one of these ships, sometime around the early 5th century BC, sailed a man known as Hanno the Navigator. Hanno's mission was bold, even by Carthaginian standards. He commanded 60 ships, carrying what inscriptions claim were 30,000 people, bound not for war, but for discovery. He sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, leaving the familiar blue of the Mediterranean behind. Ahead lay the unknown Atlantic Ocean, a realm of storms, strange winds, and lands no civilized people had ever seen. Hanno's voyage would take him down the west coast of Africa, to lands of dense forests, red earth, and rivers filled with crocodiles. He established colonies along the way, trading posts that would expand Carthage's reach even further into the world. The Carthaginians brought with them tools, seeds, idols of their gods, and goods to exchange with whatever peoples they met. Every corner of the ship was crammed with cargo. To those who watched these vessels sail from the Tunisian coast, they must have seemed like floating cities, drifting into the edge of the world. According to an old Greek translation of Hanno's travel record, once kept in Carthage's Temple of Baal, his journey was filled with both amazing discoveries and frightening dangers. Hanno wrote of fire mountains that lit up the sky, likely volcanic eruptions seen from afar. He described lands where the stars themselves seemed to burn, and of people with fur-covered bodies who hurled stones at the Carthaginian crews from the shore. These hairy women, Hanno said, were captured and brought aboard, but they fought fiercely, and the sailors were forced to kill them. Their pelts were brought back to Carthage, where they were displayed in temples as proof of what they had found. It is from this tale that the Greeks later coined a strange word, guerrillae. Despite storms, hunger, and terror, Hanno's expedition succeeded. He had gone further than any Carthaginian before him, further perhaps than any Mediterranean sailor of the age. In the lands of what is now Mauritania and Senegal, the Carthaginians learned a new kind of trade, one without words. They would place their goods on the beach and retreat. The locals would emerge, examine the goods, and leave gold dust or ivory beside them. If the Carthaginians accepted the offer, they took the trade. If not, the locals would add more until both sides were satisfied, all without a single word spoken. It was called the silent trade of commerce, built not on language but on trust and fear. By Hanno's time, Carthage had become the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Its colonies stretched from Spain to North Africa, from Sardinia to the Atlantic coast. It ruled by trade, by wealth, and by the power of its navy. But far to the north, another city was rising, one that did not trade, but conquered, one that did not sail for discovery, but for dominion. The Romans had tasted victory, and they would come again. And this time they would not stop until Carthage itself burned. The silent trade. The principle of trade was simple and almost poetic in its ritual. On distant African shores, Carthaginian merchants would arrive at dawn. They would step off their ships and spread out their wares upon the sand, with jars of olive oil, carved ivory, and shimmering fabrics dyed the color of kings. Then they would retreat. The local tribesmen would emerge from the forest. They too would lay down their goods: gold dust, animal skins, precious stones. Neither side spoke. No words, no gestures, no bargaining, only silence. Each trader would study what the other had offered. If both were satisfied, the goods changed hands. If not, one side would step back, waiting patiently for more to be added. This quiet, wordless system was built on mutual respect and caution. It allowed civilizations separated by language, culture, and fear to trade in peace. At this moment, it was not just business, it was the art of trust. And through this system, they built a network of trade that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the edge of the known world. While Hanno the navigator was sailing south into the blazing winds of Africa, another Carthaginian admiral named Himilco, who turned his prow toward the unknown north. Where Hanno faced heat, Himilco faced darkness and cold. He sailed into the Bay of Biscay, up the Atlantic coast of France, and across the fog-choked waters of the English Channel. Some stories claim he reached the Tin Islands, now known as Britain and Cornwall, a location where the earth itself was rich with tin, the lifeblood of Carthage's bronze industry. Some ancient authors suggest that Himilco's voyage went beyond the edges of the map, into the North Sea, perhaps even to the mysterious lands across the Atlantic. Is it a myth, or a glimpse of forgotten history? No one can say for certain. But if it were true, then the Phoenicians and Carthaginians were the first global explorers, centuries before the age of discovery ever began. Wherever they went, from Lebanon to North Africa, from Spain to Sardinia, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians were known for one thing above all: purple, the color of royalty, the color of power, the color that defined an empire. Their most famous export was Tyrian purple, a dye so rare, so costly, that only kings, queens, and gods could afford it. The first purple dye factories were built on the coasts of Lebanon as early as the 2nd millennium BC, and from there, the craft spread to every corner of the Phoenician world, including Carthage. The secret ingredient was a small, unassuming sea snail known as the murex. When crushed, it released a pungent, oily fluid that transformed into the most vibrant shade of purple known to the ancient world. But the process was horrific. The smell was unbearable. Entire workshops reeked of decay as thousands of snails were boiled to extract just a few drops of dye. Yet the result was priceless. According to legend, it was a god who first discovered the secret. Walking along the shore with his white dog, the deity noticed that the animal's mouth had turned deep purple after biting into a snail. When the god wiped the color onto a cloth, he realized there was no blood. It was beautiful. From that discovery came an empire's fortune. Even today, the process remains mysterious. Few people know how to make true Tyrian purple. But one artist in France, Inga Berskin-Connolly, has dedicated her life to reviving it. She explains with the same quiet reverence once shown in the workshops of ancient Sidon, where she said cooking the snail is easy. Extracting its soul, or the dye, is the hard part. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder described the process in his writings. First, the glands were cut from the snails and left to soak in water. Slowly, the liquid turned from pale blue to greenish, then to a murky grey, and finally to a clear golden yellow. Then came the long wait. The mixture had to ferment, often in urine or potash, for days under gentle warmth until the color deepened. And when the cloth was finally dipped and exposed to sunlight, a miracle happened. The yellow faded to violet, the violet darkened to crimson, and the crimson became royal purple. No two batches were ever the same. Each carried a tone that depended on the sea, the season, and the snail. It was the dye of gods and conquerors, worn by emperors, demanded by pharaohs, and coveted by Carthaginian merchants who traded it for gold. But Carthage's greatest legacy was not a color. It was a system of symbols that changed the world forever. Wherever the Phoenicians traded, they carried language, writing, and memory. In their bustling ports, trade required records, lists of goods, prices, weights, and promises. Clay tablets and complex pictographs were too slow, too cumbersome. The Phoenicians needed something faster, simpler, universal, so they invented it: the alphabet. 22 simple signs, each representing a single sound. No gods, no symbols, no hieroglyphic mysteries, just letters. It was revolutionary. No longer did writing belong only to priests or scholars. Merchants, sailors, and craftsmen could now learn to write and read. This invention became the foundation of literacy across the ancient world. From Phoenicia, it spread to Carthage, then to Greece, then to Rome, and finally across all of Europe. In the ancient Near East, other civilizations wrote in cuneiform or hieroglyphs. intricate systems requiring years of study. But the Phoenician alphabet was democratic. It broke knowledge free from the grip of temples and kings. Each sound had a sign, each sign could build a word, and each word could record a story, a law, a name, and a life. Priests inscribed prayers, merchants kept ledgers, sailors wrote logs. With every voyage, the alphabet spread further, to Cyprus, Greece, Etruria, and Carthage. From it came Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Cyrillic, and Latin, and through Rome's empire, the Latin alphabet reached the tribes of northern Europe. The very letters you're reading now, the same ones that once flowed from a Phoenician quill over 3,000 years ago. From a handful of traders on the Lebanese coast, a system of marks and sounds traveled through empires, languages, and time, carrying the voices of the ancient world into ours. So, while Carthage is remembered for its wealth, its ships, and its wars, perhaps its greatest gift was something less tangible. It was communication itself. From purple dye to silent trade, from Hanno's voyages to the birth of writing, the Carthaginians and their Phoenician ancestors did not just conquer seas, they connected worlds. They left behind not ruins but words, and words, unlike cities, never die. The fire that consumed the world. It began with 22 simple symbols with marks carved into clay and inked onto papyrus. But from those humble signs came the foundation of everything we now call civilization. Without the Phoenician alphabet, neither Greek philosophy nor Roman law would have been possible. Those same letters that once marked shipments of wine and silver would later give birth to the words of Plato, the speeches of Cicero, and the poetry of Virgil. Through writing, the world found its voice. For the first time, ideas could travel farther than their creators. Knowledge could be stored, copied, and passed from generation to generation, first on animal skins, then on paper, and later pressed into the printed word. Even now, in our digital age, where light and code carry our thoughts across the planet, the DNA of our communication still descends from those same 22 characters. Every book, every email, every inscription on every monument is a whisper of Phoenicia. But as writing endured, the people who had first given the world its letters began to vanish from history. Only ruins, scattered artifacts, and fragments of inscriptions remained to tell their story. And the reason for that erasure was Rome. For centuries, Carthage and Rome had coexisted, sometimes rivals, sometimes allies, but always aware of one another. There were treaties between them, trade routes shared, and even military cooperation. Carthaginian merchants walked freely through Roman ports, and Roman ambassadors visited the glittering markets of Carthage. For a time, there was peace, but peace has a fragile heartbeat. It survives only while both sides need it. As Rome expanded, swallowing up Italy in the 4th century BC, it began to hunger for more, and Carthage, rich and dominant across the western Mediterranean, stood directly in its path. At the center of this growing tension lay the island of Sicily, the crossroads of the ancient world. For centuries, Carthage had fought small wars there against Greek city-states, slowly taking control of its western shores. To the Carthaginians, Sicily was theirs by right of conquest. But to the eastern Greeks of Syracuse, Rome now seemed like a potential savior with a new rising power that might finally break Carthage's grip. The spark was lit, and Sicily would become the matchstick that ignited a century of war. When the First Punic War erupted in 264 BC, Rome had never fought a naval battle. They were soldiers of the land and farmers turned legions. Carthage, on the other hand, ruled the sea. Their shipyards were legendary, their admirals unmatched. At first, Rome floundered literally. Their fleets sank in storms, their crews drowned, and their tactics were primitive compared to Carthaginian seamanship. But Rome adapted. They captured a Carthaginian ship that had washed ashore and copied it piece by piece, plank for plank, nail for nail. They studied its design, learned its secrets, and built hundreds like it. Then, in a stroke of innovation, the Romans turned sea warfare into a land battle. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that could latch onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to fight as if they were on solid ground. It worked. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet was annihilated. Rome had won its first war at sea, and Carthage, humiliated, was forced to surrender Sicily. But the wound ran deep, but Carthage would not forgive, and Rome would not forget. In the years that followed, Carthage rebuilt its strength. Under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca, A brilliant general and statesman, the city turned its ambitions westward, conquering new lands in Spain to recover its lost wealth. Hamilcar's son, Hannibal, grew up in this world of vengeance. As a boy, legend says, he was brought to the altar of Baal, where he swore a solemn oath to hate Rome for as long as he lived. He would keep that promise. When the Second Punic War broke out in 218 BC, Hannibal did what no one believed possible. With an army of 90,000 men, cavalry, and war elephants, he crossed the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and finally the Alps, a frozen, deadly barrier the Romans thought impassable. It was one of the most astonishing military feats in history. On the other side, Hannibal descended into Italy like a storm. He crushed Roman legions at the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, where over 50,000 Romans were slaughtered in a single day. The phrase Hannibal ad portas was heard through Rome, meaning Hannibal at the gates. But Hannibal never attacked the city itself. He waited for allies who never came. And as the years dragged on, Rome's resilience began to show. They refused to surrender. They learned, adapted, and countered. Finally, at Zama in 202 BC, near the walls of Carthage itself, Hannibal faced the Roman general Scipio Africanus. This time, fate turned against him. The Carthaginian elephants panicked under the Roman trumpets, trampling their own men. Hannibal's army broke. Carthage was defeated once more. And Hannibal, who was the greatest general of his age, soon became a fugitive, wandering from court to court, hunted by Rome, until at last, cornered and betrayed, he took poison rather than be captured. With his death, Carthage lost not only its hero, but its hope. But for Rome, victory was not enough. The fear of Carthage still lingered like a shadow. In the Roman Senate, an old statesman named Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the subject, with the same words, Carthago delenda est, meaning Carthage must be destroyed. And eventually, Rome listened. In 149 BC, nearly 40 years after Hannibal's death, Roman legions landed once again on African soil. This time they came not to fight an enemy, but to erase one. For 3 years, the Carthaginians resisted with desperate courage. They fortified their walls, melted down their jewelry for weapons, and fought street by street, house by house. But in 146 BC, the walls finally fell. Carthage burned, and its people were slain or enslaved. Its harbor filled with rubble, its libraries turned to ash. Eventually, the greatest city of the Western Mediterranean was wiped from the map. Carthage was no more, and yet the story did not end there. Though the city was destroyed, its spirit survived, scattered across the Mediterranean, carried by merchants, sailors, and settlers who had once called Carthage home. Its colonies in Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily lived on, absorbed into the Roman world. Its innovations in trade, navigation, and urban design shaped the empire that had once sworn to destroy it. In time, Rome itself became what Carthage had been, a maritime empire, a hub of commerce, a center of global exchange. Carthage's spirit of exploration, its drive for discovery, and its genius for trade became the blueprint for the world we live in today. It was the first great engine of globalization, with a civilization that believed in crossing boundaries, sharing knowledge and reaching beyond the horizon, and above all, it left behind the alphabet, the true immortal legacy of Phoenicia and Carthage. From those 22 ancient letters came the words of Homer, the decrees of Caesar, the scriptures of faith, and the languages of modern Europe. The same characters still flicker across our screens thousands of years later. Carthage fell to fire and steel, but its language, trade, and vision endured. For though Rome destroyed her body, Carthage's soul lives on in every word we write. The ashes of empire. When the fires of Carthage finally died, the air above the ruins shimmered with smoke and silence. For 17 days, flames had devoured the city, with temples collapsing, marble statues melting into molten pools, and once proud harbor walls crumbling beneath the relentless hammer of Roman siege engines. Legionaries marched through the ashes, and in their wake, centuries of Carthaginian power were reduced to dust. It was said that the Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus, as he looked upon the devastation, wept. He gave a line from Homer's Iliad, foreseeing that the same fate would one day come for Rome. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be no more Carthage. The queen of the seas, the merchant of empires, and the rival of Rome was gone. But empires rarely die cleanly. Even in ruin, Carthage's shadow still stretched across the Mediterranean. Its ports, its colonies, its trade networks all continued to hum with life. And in a twist of fate, it would be Rome itself who would revive what it once destroyed. With Carthage's fall, Rome inherited not just its territories, but its destiny. No longer confined to the Italian peninsula, Rome now ruled lands once bound together by the Carthaginian sea routes, from North Africa to Spain, from Corsica to Sardinia. They took over Carthaginian harbors, shipyards, and trading outposts, turning them into Roman provinces and naval bases. The Roman Republic, that was once a nation of farmers and soldiers, was now a maritime empire. Ironically, Rome began to mirror the very civilization it had sought to erase. They adopted Carthage's methods of shipbuilding with those same modular prefabricated techniques once pioneered in Punic dockyards. They learned to manage distant colonies through trade and taxation, and they filled their markets with the same goods once carried in Carthaginian holds: spices, gold, ivory, slaves, and the purple dye that had once made Phoenicia famous. Carthage's ghost had entered the bloodstream of Rome. Her idea, her economy, and her vision lived on inside the empire that had slain her. A century after its destruction, the site of Carthage remained a barren wound. Roman law forbade anyone to rebuild upon its ashes. The land was cursed, or so it was said. Farmers avoided it. Sailors crossed themselves when they saw its outline on the coast. But time has a way of healing even the deepest scars. In 46 BC, during the reign of Julius Caesar, a new idea began to take shape. Caesar, ever the visionary, saw the potential of the site: a natural harbor, fertile plains, and a strategic position that commanded the African coast. He ordered the foundations of a new city to be laid on the ruins of the old Colonia Julia Carthago, meaning the Julian colony of Carthage. After Caesar's assassination, the project stalled, but his successor, Emperor Augustus, completed it. And from those ashes, Carthage rose again, no longer the capital of an empire, but the jewel of Roman Africa. A city reborn under Roman rule, its streets filled once more with merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. By the 2nd century AD, Roman Carthage had become one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the empire, second only to Rome and Alexandria. The harbors buzzed with ships from across the Mediterranean. Carthage, reborn, had finally found peace through transformation. For 600 years, Roman Carthage thrived as a city of trade, culture, and faith. It became one of the cradles of early Christianity, home to great thinkers like Tertullian and St. Augustine, whose words would shape the theology of Europe for 1,000 years. The city endured invasions, earthquakes, and civil wars, and even when the Vandals stormed across Africa in the 5th century AD, Carthage endured again while being scarred but unbroken. It would not be until 698 AD, when the Umayyad Caliphate conquered North Africa, that the ancient city finally fell into silence once more. But by then, Carthage had already achieved immortality and influence. Its story had become a mirror of humanity itself: creation, ambition, destruction, and rebirth. So what then remains of Carthage? No great monuments, no intact temples or towering statues, only broken walls, scattered shards, and the outlines of harbors long filled with sand. Every port that trades across an ocean, every merchant who sails beyond the horizon, every word written in the alphabets of the West, they all carry a fragment of Carthage. It was the first to imagine a world connected by commerce and culture, a world not bound by empire but by exchange. Her explorers ventured beyond the edge of the known world. Her traders bound Africa, Europe, and the Near East together centuries before Rome ever dreamed of empire. And through the alphabet of her Phoenician ancestors, Carthage gave humanity its most enduring tool: the power to write, to remember, to be immortal. Today, the ruins of Carthage lie near modern Tunis as a quiet field of broken stone and whispering wind where the sunlight glints on shattered marble buried in the dust. Tourists wander among the ruins, tracing their fingers along the edges of crumbling walls that once formed the beating heart of an empire. Here, senators debated the fate of nations. Here, merchants from across the world haggled over gold, ivory, and silk. Here, priests prayed to Baal beneath the smoke of sacred fires. It is hard to imagine that this calm landscape was once alive with sound and ambition, a city of unmatched energy whose harbors thrummed with voices from every shore of the Mediterranean. Ships once crowded the circular military port, their hulls gleaming under the African sun. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, and the scent of spices, oils, and incense filled the air. Hannibal himself may have stood where visitors stand now, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his heart filled with visions of Rome's downfall. If you stand quietly and close your eyes, you might almost hear the sound of oars striking the waves, the crash of surf against Punic hulls, the distant roar of war elephants marching through the dust. You can almost sense the pulse of the city that once challenged the might of Rome itself. Beneath the calm blue waters of the Gulf of Tunis, the ghosts of Carthaginian sailors still seem to row onward, chasing the memory of glory. Carthage is gone and its walls toppled, its temples burned and its name nearly erased, and yet it was never truly lost. Its ashes became seeds, carried by the winds of time across the world. The spirit of Carthage lives on in the trade routes that circle the globe, in the harbors that mirror her design, and in the alphabets that descended from her Phoenician ancestors. Every time ships set sail toward the unknown, or merchants bargain across distant lands, they carry the legacy of this once great city. For as long as humankind sails the seas, as long as we write, build, explore, and dream beyond our shores, Carthage endures. It burns eternally, but in the fires of memory and imagination. Its story is the story of resilience, of creation and destruction, of pride and renewal. The Romans may have razed it to the ground, scattering salt upon its fields, but they could not erase its idea. Carthage became more than stone. It became a symbol that greatness can rise again from ruin, and that no empire, however powerful, lasts forever. Carthage may have burned, but from its ashes rose the modern world. It has taught humanity that the sea is not just a barrier, but a bridge, and now that trade can no longer be seen as mere profit, but connection, and that memory, once written, can outlive even the mightiest walls.